if ever Israel is weaker than any combination of Arab states, no Arab leader could survive unless they took the initiative and went after Israel. Even Sadat knew that. Sadat knew the only road to peace was to attack Israel in 1973, win a moral victory, and then maybe he could go to the bargaining table.
Well, I want to get
Please.
Now, I've seen some hands that have gotten my attention. So I promise you, if there's one back there, don't lie, you know who had his hand up. Find a microphone. I have already acknowledged over here. We may not get everybody in, but let's try to do that. Come on.
Professor Dershowitz?
Yes.
Thank you for coming here and for your passionate speech. But I seem to have some fundamental problems with your method of reasoning and your logic to expose a couple of instances. The first one is that you said in your speech that every citizen who votes for an autocratic, which ultimately becomes an autocratic government, is responsible for the actions of that government. Later on, in response to Albert Kahn's question, you mentioned that Hamas started off as structural democracy and turned into, I forget the term that he used, but basically a functional autocracy. Now, how do you first, that was the first part of my question, how do you reconcile responsibility of the citizens when you acknowledge a shift from structural democracy to autocracy, and especially keeping in light of what's happening in the US? And the second part of it is that you mentioned that if you go to Google and you search Palestine, and you search China, you search Tibet, you search other places in the world where stuff similar to Palestine has been happening, you will find a lot more attention on Palestine. I think you might be misattributing the causality, because I think that part of the reason why Palestine receives so much attention in the media is because US is an ally of Israel, and other parts of the world do not get as much attention because US, which is in a unipolar world, the center of attention, does not draw as much attention to Tibet and other places, and also the US controls a large part of the internet.
Well, without regard to what the reasons are, and by the way, I will disagree with your reasons, but without regard to what the reasons are, you acknowledge the fact that Palestinians get more ink, more media time than all the other groups in the world combined. That is completely at odds with what President Carter is saying. He is simply, demonstrably, and provably wrong when he says that Palestinians don't have the attention of the media. And he didn't mention college campuses. You can't get a demonstration on most college campuses against the atrocities in Darfur. They're too busy demonstrating for Palestinians. Gays for Palestinians. I love that sign. You know what happens to gays for Palestinians in Palestine? They have to seek asylum in Israel because they're persecuted in Palestine. Feminists for Palestine. Environmentalists for Palestine. But none of these support the policies of feminism and environmentalism. I just want to answer the first question about structural and functional. It's a very good point. And the same thing was true, by the way, in Germany, when people voted for the Nazis and then the Nazis took away their power to dissent. Yet, in a war, when you are fighting against a tyrannical regime like Nazi Germany, inevitably the people of the country bear responsibility. Inevitably they suffer from the bombings like in Dresden and other places. Inevitably the Japanese people suffered because even in that case they didn't even vote for it. But when you vote for Hamas, then you bear the consequences. And you ought to know that when you vote. When you go into that booth, it's not a free vote. You vote for tyrants, you vote for terrorists, you're going to get your funding cut off. They knew that going in, and they were prepared for that. By the way, Hamas is happy that funding is cut off. Why? They prefer a poor, oppressed people. That helps with the religious message they send. By the way, that's not the only people that do that. There's a famous story, I hope you'll pardon me 1 minute. Famous story of the Lubavitcher Rebbe during the Napoleonic Wars, in which everybody, all the Jewish community was rooting for Napoleon to win the wars against the Tsar, who was anti-Semitic. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe said he was rooting for the Tsar to win. He said if Napoleon wins, then the rights of individual Jews will be vindicated, but the Jewish community will fall apart because of the civil liberties of the individual Jews. But if the Tsar wins, the Jewish community will stay more Jewish. I call this the Tsarist theory of Jewish survival, that Jews need troubles and external. And by the way, it operates with Hamas too. If there were civil liberties, if there were a viable state, if there were an economically successful state, Hamas would become a marginal party. It's the fact that people are in poverty, that people are poor, that gives them the increased power. But when the fault for their poverty is placed squarely on their shoulders, there is a possibility that people will come to their senses and vote against this tyrannical regime. Thank you for your question. Follow up?
No, let's get some.
Okay.
You mind if we just go to others?
Whatever. You're the moderator. Go ahead.
You were here when it was said that Hamas is too Jewish. That was the point of the last anecdote. Please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Abir. I'm a Muslim. I'm a PhD student at Heller School.
Hi.
I would like to ask you, actually, first I would like to have a comment that Israel was established by a UN decision.
No.
The division decision was part of establishing Israel, so I think that's an important decision.
But the UN didn't establish Israel, Israel established itself.
But it was an important decision, so the UN is not all the time against
I agree with
Israel.
you. I agree with you.
So this is one of the points. Another point I would like to make, it's so easy that we start exchange blames between two different parties and say, you caused it, we're not gonna respond, we're gonna have another act of violence. It's so easy to do that. But I don't think also that give Israel an excuse to practice state terrorism against Palestinian civilians. And
I would agree with that if it were happening.
and I would, no. But my question, especially that you said that you had were involved or you had a very big roles in drafting laws, negotiation.
Small world.
You are involved in a way, you know the networks, you know what could be do, I think, better than a lot of us. So maybe you can really give us an advice about also how can we approach, I'm a Palestinian, and I would like really to know how can we really approach Israel instead of having more provoking of radical movement among the Palestinians, because I believe the result is not only the results that we have now were accumulating over the time, and I believe Israel played a role in reaching that. So how can we really approach Israel instead of just blaming the other party? How can we really approach Israel to give, instead of bombing certain places or having checkpoints or building the wall, to give a hand that have an olive branch so we can really have peace, especially that it's the strongest part.
I agree with that.
Thanks.
I think it's a very, very good question. I would, however, distinguish between what Israel can do in terms of territorial returns and asking Israel to compromise its security. Israel should not compromise at all on checkpoints. Checkpoints have been extraordinarily effective. 10,000 terrorist acts have been prevented by checkpoints. And given a choice between waiting an hour and uncomfortableness and having people go into the middle of downtown Tel Aviv and blow up buses, I have to tell you, if I were a Palestinian or an Israeli or somebody from Mars, I would much prefer to see the delays and the checkpoints. Checkpoints will disappear instantaneously when terrorism disappears. There are no checkpoints in the Gaza. There is still a terrorism. But I think Israel can do a great deal. Israel should end the settlements. I have urged that since 1973. Israel has made a terrible mistake. I think in 1967, when it conquered the West Bank, not as the result, by the way, Jimmy Carter says in his book that Jordan was preemptively attacked by Israel. Every historian in the world knows that's false. Israel preemptively attacked Syria and the Egyptian air forces and then told Jordan, please don't get in the war. We will not even try to recapture the holy city of Jewish Jerusalem. We will not attack you if you don't attack us first. Don't attack first. Jordan fired 1,600 shells into downtown Jerusalem, captured the area up to International House, and when Israel felt itself surrounded by Jordanian troops, it then went in and ended the Jordanian occupation of the West Bank and ended the Egyptian occupation of the Gaza, which nobody complained about for 20 years. But then it made a terrible mistake. Instead of accepting the Alon plan, which would have permitted for territorial adjustments, completely for security reasons, it allowed settlers to move into the West Bank and the Gaza. It ended the settlements in the Gaza, too little, too late, but it finally ended them. I wish it will end the settlements in the West Bank. I think starting out by ending settlements that have nothing to do with security is something I will hear and have always urged Israel to do. That's the olive branch it can offer. It cannot offer the olive branch of lowering the security fence, ending the checkpoints, or doing anything that would compromise the security of its own civilians.
Okay.
Okay.
I want her to have a quick
Last response, please.
But I think that's part of it, because I was passing through the checkpoint every day till I came here to Brandeis last August. And I know it's the most humiliating experience that you ever live.
You're talking to the wrong people.
But I don't think I'm talking to the wrong people, because I think a place like Brandeis will have a real impact, because you have a real diversity of educated like Brandeis is very well known for its ethics, and I really believe it's a very good place.
I agree with that, right?
But for that, and because also it has a very good influence, I would say, how can we really approach? I would think the checkpoints, keeping them as an act, it's increasing fundamentalism. But how can we really approach to decrease that through, in Israel? I don't think you gave me, sorry, an answer.
Oh, well, let me give you the answer. It's very simple. When I say talking to the wrong people, I mean you should be talking to the Palestinian leadership. They can end the checkpoints instantaneously. All they have to do is the Palestinian Authority has to disarm Hamas, disarm Islamic Jihad, and the checkpoints will end. The checkpoints are only terrorist prevention checkpoints. That's all they are. I agree with you, by the way, that any gratuitous humiliation should end, but I would not recommend to Israel, as a moral person, I would not urge Israel to make your security, to reduce your humiliation at the cost of Israeli lives. The trade-off isn't worth it. Sorry. If you want to end the humiliation, then have Palestinian authorities end the terrorism. There is a 1-to-1 ratio between the checkpoints, the humiliation, and the terrorism.
Do I have a microphone over here? Please, that's the line. Thank you. We have 5 minutes.
I'm happy to stay, but I guess I'm getting kicked out. But okay, okay.
Professor Dershowitz.
Hi.
Hi. Towards the beginning of your talk and this question and answer session, I attempted to count the number of times you alluded to Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. I regret to say, Professor, I've lost count.
What's your point?
My point is, why are we talking about Adolf Hitler?
Because we have a man in Iran who was like Adolf Hitler, that's why. And he who forgets the past is destined to repeat it.
Professor, respectfully, I think you could have said Joseph Stalin.
No, I couldn't have. Because Joseph Stalin's goal was not to destroy the Jews and to destroy the Jewish state. Adolf Hitler's goal was, and so is the president of Iran. It's a perfect analogy. And when Winston Churchill said, go and attack Hitler before he gets power, and Chamberlain said, no, we made a terrible, terrible mistake. It cost the world tens of millions of lives. And I do not want to see the current Iranian government, which is determined to destroy the Jewish people. Remember what the head of Hezbollah said, who was an Iranian person. He hopes the Jews of America will come to Israel so they can be killed there and we won't have to go after them all around the world. Tell me the analogy to Hitler is not an appropriate one. Hitler at one point was very weak. He had no power. Everybody thought he was a tin-horn dictator. You know, by the way, if France and England had gone after Hitler and destroyed the Nazi war machine and killed Hitler, they would have been regarded as the bully boys of the world, because nobody would have known what Hitler would have produced. That's the virtue of preemption. It's also the vice of preemption. We don't know what Israel prevented when it went into the Osiris reactor and prevented Iraq from developing a nuclear bomb. We don't know. And that's why Israel was condemned. But if Israel didn't do that, and Iraq then used nuclear weapons against the United States or against Kuwait, or had its scuds loaded with nuclear weapons, then we would have said, why didn't Israel go in earlier? I don't want to live, or my children or my grandchildren, to live to regret not having taken Iran and the president of Iran and Hezbollah seriously. So yes, I stand by my analogy. Appreciate it.
Thank you.